So thank you very much for joining us today, everyone. This is Goodman Masson's second Diversity and Inclusion webinar. Today we're going to be focused on strategy, so D&I Strategy and an overview of that. Just to introduce myself, so my name's Catherine Kellaway. I'm a director at Goodman Masson. I've been in recruitment for 12 years now. Diversity and inclusion in the workplace is something I'm hugely passionate about. I've actually taken on a role recently at Goodman Masson of driving and developing our diversity and inclusion strategy. And I think for lots of clients that we work with across all sectors, we've seen a huge increase in demand and questions about how can we support clients in their approach to diversity and inclusion. So one thing that we've committed to doing is sharing our lessons and also producing useful content that can add value to our clients around the area of diversity and inclusion. So as we develop this content and have more specific sector-specific sessions, we'll be working with Lenna, our non-executive director, and using her expertise in this area to develop these sessions. So if you do have any particular areas that you'd like to focus on and discuss in a more detailed, intimate setting, let us know, and we'll be sharing the content of those webinars and sessions. As we move through the presentation today and the webinar today, if you do have any questions, just pop those in the chat box, and we'll ask those to Lenna at the end and check that we can keep her on her toes.
Yeah, absolutely. As Catherine said, my name is Lenna Cumberbatch. I'm the new non-executive director at Goodman Masson, and I've been working in diversity and inclusion for about 20 years now in a variety of different areas in the UK and the US, and working with the European Commission as well. I'm currently doing my PhD in diversity and inclusion strategic change at University of St Andrews, so hopefully I have a few answers. I'm sure I won't have all of them, but we'll do our best to get them to you when we get to that point if necessary. But otherwise, we'll be taking you through a series of pieces of information here, and yeah, feel free to just post when you have an opportunity to do so. So in terms of our content today, we'll be covering three core areas. We'll be looking at what is diversity versus inclusion, like that, understanding that difference between the two. Looking at SMART objectives, and when we're writing a strategy, one of the key areas is writing objectives for what we want to accomplish, but are we able to accomplish them? Are they SMART? And then looking at actually taking action in this area. So what are things that we're doing, the steps that we're taking that will accomplish our objectives in the long run? So first of all, let's look at what is diversity. So diversity is this state or fact of being diverse. It's in existence, a difference, unlikeness, a variety or multiformity. And that's compared with, for example, inclusion, which is the act of including, something that is included. So whereas diversity is a state of being, inclusion is an act, it's an action, it's things that you do, it's the way that you behave, it's the things that we accomplish. If you think of, in some ways, diversity as a destination.
Yes, I think from that, a good summary is how well we actually do inclusion can contribute to how diverse we can be. Yeah. So good way to think about it is that diversity is your reward for doing inclusion. Yeah,
that's brilliant. Yeah, absolutely. So looking now, also we have this, we tend to have this approach to diversity, that diversity is this thing that we see and we can see it and it's visible, but it's really clear to understand that diversity is not always visible. You may have heard the term invisible disabilities, mental health diagnoses, neurodiversity, arthritis, etc. But in invisibility, can be true for all the protected characteristics, whether that be age, gender, reassignment, marriage and civil partnership, pregnancy and maternity, race, religion, belief, sex and sexual orientation. I mean, ultimately, if you're not asking people about their diversity, then you don't know what it is. You can't be sure.
Yeah, I think a good example of an inclusive practice that we've recently implemented at Goodman Masson is, our approach to agile working. So, for example, if somebody has a particular set of religious beliefs and when they're not necessarily visible, we don't know about them, actually our inclusive approach of agile working will support that individual in being able to, for example, take prayer time, when it's convenient and appropriate for them through the use of agile working. So I think that comes back to the point around, doing inclusivity and having inclusive processes and procedures and policies that involve all diversities, even those that aren't necessarily.
Yeah, absolutely. That inclusive practice approach really makes it something that, particularly with agile working, the way you've described it, means that you don't have to make a special allowance for somebody's thing. It just means everybody has that opportunity. No, absolutely brilliant. Thank you. It's important to remember that inclusion is an ongoing process, where it can be active or passive, but it's ongoing. You can have all of the right policies in place, but do your team know about them and understand them? So have you talked about agile working and how it works in your organization, right? So are they rated as effective in employee surveys? What action are you taking to be inclusive every day? So if you think of an example of if your CEO is going to attend the launch event for your staff LGBT network, that's great and that's really brilliant. I definitely applaud and think that that's a really great idea. But if that's the only thing you do, if that's where you stop, then you stop your inclusive activity. So I was inclusive that time that I went to the thing that one time. And, this will come up a couple of times over our talk today, but I think it's really important to remember the ongoing nature of being inclusive on a regular basis.
Yeah, kind of asking yourself the question, what am I doing today to be inclusive? What have I done? Yes. What action have I taken?
Exactly.
So when we think about diversity and inclusion strategy, I think the starting point in the beginning is, what is your diversity and inclusion vision? And I think, there's a great example here from Martin Luther King, the ultimate vision. I have a dream that my 4 little children will one day live in a nation where they will be judged not by the colour of their skin, but the content of their character. Yeah. I think everybody knew exactly what he was fighting for and asking people to sign up for when he asked people to follow him. And it's got to be exactly the same in your company's diversity and inclusion vision. What are you asking people to sign up for? And I think when we first started working with Lenna, you asked some really good questions. What could be, in terms of Goodman Masson's, what could your diversity and inclusion vision look like, strategy look like? What would good look like for you, and what's realistic? I think is an important question to ask as well. And that led us to, you can see here, this is the start of our vision. I think we want to make very clear that, look, recruitment's for everyone. And I want to work in a consultancy. We want a consultancy which is equally led by, influenced by, and built by recruiters who are representative from all the areas that we've got offices in, so London, Dusseldorf, and New York. And that's a message that I'm really proud to push out. And, I want people in the organisation to be proud to push out and, to be aware of that's what we're doing and that's what we're working towards. So I think there's some really good questions. What could be, what does good look like, and what's realistic when you're thinking about your vision?
Absolutely. And I think in line with that, in terms of what's realistic, is thinking about your approach, generally speaking. And so what are the priorities that you have for your diversity inclusion vision? Do you want to meet the minimum required? What's necessary to be compliant? So we meet the requirements of the Equality Act and that's sufficient for us. Or are you taking a step further and being conservative, meeting the average and following the lead of others and keeping pace with similar organizations? Or is this about we're going to be innovative and we're going to constantly seek out and try new ways to be more inclusive, regularly reviewing and refreshing existing activity? And if I give you a specific and practical example of what that looks like, for example, for somebody who's transitioning, giving them the minimum requirement, allowing for sick leave and allowance for that, for a more long in terms of conservative and following the lead of others, then you'd be looking at something like, well, we're happy to give you additional leave for this process to take place. But if you're looking at an innovative approach, one option may be saying, okay, well, for anybody who's transitioning, then they automatically get 4 months leave specifically for that purpose. And that means that the health and well-being of your staff and employees is coming first for them, and they can see that and they understand that and they feel safe in doing that and moving on in that direction. But that brings us back then to how you see your D&I vision as an organization, in your teams, as individuals. And so keeping in mind, when we talk about you and your, we're talking not about just as you as an individual, but you as an organization, the line managers of your teams, the team leaders, the individuals in your organization, and where are they on this D&I journey? You know, for them, for you, is this a tick box exercise? Is this something that only people who are really passionate about it, like the focus of the women in the team? Is it good for business? Or is it important to your organization identity? Because everybody's going to be in different places, and it's what, when we talk about making sure that people are on that journey with you in your vision, and I seeing your vision, this is what we're talking about. Are we bringing them along?
Yeah, I think, you know, the kind of point to a good example of that last example there, you know, is how important is it to your organization's identity? Something that Goodman Masson have recently done is reviewed our job specifications, and for every job specification there's detail around what is expected at your level in your approach to diversity and inclusion. And I think that's a really clear message to anyone who works at Goodman Masson, that actually diversity and inclusion is central to us as an organization. And you know, it's important in terms of you will have to be involved in this to progress your career with Goodman Masson. So I think a really kind of clear message of what the vision is.
Brilliant. And that's perfect. I mean, that's a perfect example when the expectations for you as an individual are aligned with the expectations for the company and the organization overall. And that's the next point that I'd like to make, is talking about the alignment of your D&I strategy. Now, it may be that you have a D&I strategy which is separate to your organization strategy and the way it's embedded. So, or it may be that the two are together. And so depending on how you have set up your D&I strategy, it may be that this is going to be something that is evolving as you go along. But I think it's really important to make sure that whichever way you do it, they're facing in the same direction, that you're all pulling in the same direction, you're going in the same way, and so that they are in alignment.
Yeah, definitely. I think, you know, COVID has probably thrown most organisations' strategies and plans up in the air. So probably actually a really good time to be able to question, actually, can we embed our D&I strategy within our strategy as we review it because of COVID?
Yeah, absolutely. It's the perfect opportunity to look at how you reframe it. It's completely fine to be coming from a position where you do have a separate D&I strategy, but there are opportunities to bring those two things together in the long run, ongoing. So if we are looking at your, whether that strategy is together or separate, but if you've got this great vision of, I'm going to live in a nation where they will be judged by the color of their skin, but not by the color of their skin, but by the content of their character, then maybe you've got this, you've got your objectives, your XYZ objectives that come along with your strategy. And if that's your separate strategy, then XYZ are going to all be about diversity and inclusion. But if this is a part of your embedded in your overall strategic procedure for the organization, then what you want to try and avoid doing is adding on just the last bullet point at the end that's about, oh yeah, and the diversity inclusion stuff on the side. It's totally fine. So for example, in this example, you may decide to choose, we're just going to pick ethnicity and focus on that as an area. That's not to say that we're not going to do inclusion for the whole organization and make sure that everybody's feeling like they're here. And we're going to come back to that at the end as well. But it's okay to focus and say, okay, well, maybe we're based in Birmingham and the diversity of the city is not quite matching the diversity of the team. And so we're going to focus on that. We're going to focus on ethnicity and race. And so totally fine to look at that as an area to focus alongside of the inclusion work that you're doing it separately. But what I'd like to see is, rather than that add-on separate bullet point over there, is however you do your diversity and inclusion, when you create your vision statement, your next step is creating your objectives, and that within your objectives is diversity and inclusion. So your objective X, action 1, action 2, diversity and inclusion action. Objective Y, diversity and inclusion action 2, action 3, objective Z. So that diversity and inclusion is really thread all the way through all of your strategic plan, over and under, so that when you are addressing things, you can see diversity and inclusion as a part of all of your objectives for your strategy. So objectives. Let's get smart about those, right? So you've heard about it before. I know we don't want to do it over and over again, but we will just go into some details about why SMART objectives are important. So SMART, for those of you who don't know, is specific, measurable, achievable, relevant, and time-bound. SMART objectives allow you to actually measure what's happening and whether or not you're achieving the goals that you're setting out for yourself. Diversity and inclusion requires resources, all sorts of different sorts of resources. But what's really important is being able to measure the effectiveness of the resources that you're putting into diversity and inclusion. Are the things that you're doing working? Are they having an impact? And when you make your objectives smart, then you can look back and see and measure how they did or didn't have an impact on what you were doing. So let's work through a little example of one. For example, an objective could be good diversity in employees and applicants. That's really vague, non-specific, not really measurable and not time-bound either. But if you change that instead to an employee and applicant pool, which is representative of the diversity of the city where we are based by 2023, then you've got some really specific points at which point you can measure. There are a variety of different areas that you can pull out and say, have we done this part? So for example, an action that goes along with this objective would be, 1, collect data about employees and applicants. And once you've collected that data, then you can check it off and say, okay, this has been done. Next action, find benchmarking data for the city. Now, this is about, do you have something to compare your data with? Because it's important to make sure that you can compare data with whoever it is, because you've said your action, your objective says you're going to compare it with the city. Next, we're looking at going through identifying the differences in the representation. Now, do you meet that Brummy population? And it may be that you need to collect more data in order to understand and identify where you are having differences. But that analysis comes first. And then the next stage is going to be setting targets for change. Now, if you know that the city is at 20% and you're at 5%, then you can say to yourself, okay, well, we need to demonstrate a 5% increase in our demographics in the next 2 years and a 20% in the next 5 years. So maybe these are where you set how you set your targets is by looking at the data that you have, analyzing the gaps in it, and then taking a step and setting a target on that basis. Again, check. Specific, measurable, relevant, achievable, relevant, and time bound.
It's one of those things that sounds so simple, but there's a huge art to actually kind of setting smart objectives, isn't there?
Absolutely, and and when you get it right, it's really, really fruitful. So looking at specifically at taking action, what some of those actions could be, we're looking at communication. Now, communication is really important action, so we're going to use that just as an example of taking an action. Then we're going to look at using data and inclusion. So if we were talking about an example of using communication as an action, one of the things that I've really found really impressive about Goodman Masson is your town hall discussions, Catherine. I think that's a really good example of an action that we could use.
Yeah, I think this is something we've done, since we've launched the Goodman Masson's D&I Strategy, is actually communicate our vision and our strategy to the business. So on a regular basis, actually talking through what that means and bringing it to life so people know what they're signing up to. So, for example, once it's been communicated, people are much more likely to, if I ask a survey and ask people to fill in their data and give me their opinions and thoughts, much more likely to kind of provide me with that information because they know why they're being asked for that information and they know what the impact, they know what that information is going to be used for. Yeah. And then I think beyond that, you beyond the kind of communication and telling someone, you actually show someone. So, for example, Goodman Masson is committed to that we want safe spaces that people can speak about whatever are the challenges that they face and they can be supported by allies. Where we've actually shown commitment to that, beyond communicating, we've had our senior leadership team have all committed to signing up to one of those networks and turned up and been vocal. And then actually a step beyond that is actually taking somebody to the network, so bringing a buddy to the network. So showing the kind of investment and time and commitment to what we're talking about, I think is really important.
Yeah, I think that word commitment is really key there. It's like we're committed to actually delivering on the things we're promising you. And when you show people that, then they're willing to give you information, and we need them to give us information. So looking at using data, this brings us back to that diversity definition and identifying our gaps. So if we want a diversity of people in our groups, that's going to be based on a specific area of demographics. So what do you know about the demographics of your employees, your customers and clients, your executive and board? Do they match? Are they different? How do they exist in comparison to whatever that benchmark may be? but also, are you collecting useful data? Can you benchmark it externally? So that means, are you using the language that's being used by whoever your external benchmark is? Sometimes that may be the Office for National Statistics. And so are you using the language that you can compare to them with? Do you have data at different stages? So for example, at the application, interview and appointed stage for any of your applicants, because that way you can tell, are there any barriers to people making it to interview or to the appointment levels? You can see the differences in the data at those various different levels. Is it answering the questions you want to answer? Now, we talked before about our vision of being judged by the content of your character rather than the color of your skin. And so are you asking questions about data regarding ethnicity and race? But equally, are you asking, maybe you want to know about the religious background of the people. So are you asking those questions? To get into that space, let's look specifically at demographics. And so whichever demographic questions you choose to ask, and I've put here age, disability, gender identity, gender reassignment, race, ethnicity, sexual orientation. They can be as many or as few as you would like, whatever is appropriate, but it's really important to make sure that whatever you ask, you're going to be using. And so understanding, as I said before, is there something that you'd really like to know about that you're not doing, that you're not asking here and you should ask? But then also its position. So position in the company, entry-level management or senior management, we're back to whether or not there are barriers to progressing in your career and growing as an employee. And so then you want to ask about the experience of employees, because they can tell you how they feel, and you can determine based on their demographics if everybody's getting the same experience. So do they feel welcome? Do they have opportunities to grow in the organization? And would they recommend this as a good place to work? But you mustn't forget the customers. So were your customers all equally treated well, satisfied with their contact, and would return? It's really important to get an understanding of where the different people in your various stakeholders are in terms of how they experience your organization. And that would be across different demographics, positions, seniority, experiences. It wouldn't be a slide about data if I didn't remind you about GDPR. Remember, only ask a question you're going to use. Don't just ask spurious questions because you feel like it. That's one of the restrictions of GDPR, but GDPR does allow you to collect this data for legitimate use. And legitimately, you're using this to make sure that you are in compliance with the Equality Act in some ways. And so that's a base level. So even if you're looking at being innovative, as long as you can justify the use of the question, then you can include it as a part of your data collection activities. So now we've talked about data, but like I said, let's go back to inclusion, because ultimately, this is where we need to be. You don't have to wait on data to be inclusive. All too often, I hear people say, well, let's look at the data first before we do anything. You don't have to wait on data to do anything. So, for example, if you've got an objective that says create an environment which is supportive and celebrative of employees, then you can already review your HR policies and procedures for diversity and inclusion good practice. You can already create or increase, if you've already got one, support for your employee networks. You could do that by allocating or increasing an existing budget. You could make sure that an exec or director sponsors each network, as Catherine described earlier on. You could support attendance for them external activities. For example, there are Stonewall networking activities, there are Black Academics networking activities. But you could also partner with a local community charity. I think ultimately the really key point to remember here is you don't have to wait on data for inclusion. Data is an action that you'll be taking, and diversity is the destination that you're going to, but inclusion is everything. It's everything you can do, and you can do it all at the same time. So looking now, reviewing the final part of doing any strategy is reviewing what you've done. Did you meet your targets in the time frame? Did you complete the policy review or stop in the middle? Something might have gotten in the way. COVID, for example. But did you carry on? Do your employees think your organization has got better at diversity and inclusion? And have the demographics of your applicants appointees changed? Because ultimately that's what you may be trying to do in your circumstances often, is making sure that you are becoming more representative, as you had discussed. So just talking about making sure that whenever you run through one of these strategic areas and processes, that you review. And just to demonstrate that we like to practice what we preach,
here's our review of today. So I think, you know, we talked at the beginning about what we were going to focus on. I think review and kind of questions to take away are, you know, what does diversity and inclusion mean to you? And when we say you, that's everyone in the organisation, from individuals to managers to leadership. And what is the vision? Have you communicated that vision to your organisation? Do your people know what they're signing up for? And then to check your objectives are really smart, you know, to work back through them methodically, so that you can actually hold yourself accountable and determine the impact of the investments that, you know, you're asking your organisation to make. And then communication and data are key actions, but as Lenna just stressed there, you don't have to wait to be inclusive. You know, that's something that we can do and should do every day. You know, it should be very, in the same way communication should be constant, so should inclusivity.
Yeah, absolutely. And so if at this point in time you have any questions, please feel free. We'll look at what's already in the chat and we'll be here and ready to take on any questions
through, I can see. So I'll start with the nicest ones maybe first.
Thank you.
So first question, generally, how often should you review your D&I strategy?
So that's going to have a lot to do with the way that you set up your timelines and your timeframes as a part of it. You know, when you're setting a smart framework and for your strategy, it's going to be dependent. You may set targets that are for 1 year, for 3 years, for 5 years, for 10 years even. So it may be related to those timeframes that you're doing it. But generally, as a good practice policy, I would recommend reviewing your strategy every year. Just looking at where you are, have you achieved the things you were planning to achieve? There may be any number of good reasons why you haven't done it. You know, we've talked about COVID already. And so that may be a reason why you haven't changed it. So it gives you a chance to reset your timeframes, reset your targets, refocus if you want to change direction as well. And it just means that you can really look at again and make sure you're accomplishing what you plan to accomplish. And maybe you're not, maybe you're doing something different, and that's really exciting. You want to change and focus on that instead, because this unexpected outcome came as a result of it. And so those are all things that you can do if you're doing an annual check on you. And it maybe it's put a date in a diary, or it may be that it's done at the same time as other areas, because we know that in other areas of the business we do review as well.
Yeah, okay. What do you do if people on your board or leadership team are interested in D&I for different reasons? So for example, the tick box versus inherent in the organisation example that you talked through in the presentation.
Absolutely. There will always be people who don't want to jump on board this journey. And the reality is making sure that we have removed all the barriers to accessing this direction. So are we making sure that people understand why we're doing this? We talked about communication. Are we making sure that we're communicating information to them? This can be a really complicated and difficult discussion area for some people, and so they may just not feel comfortable talking about it. And so making sure that people have the opportunity to talk about it and engage without feeling stupid, because that can often be a barrier to people engaging in this discussion. So creating a safe environment for people to ask questions, to engage with this discussion. But ultimately, we've talked already about this being a part of your key performance indicators, and in terms of your reviews and etc. as a member of staff. Are they delivering? Are they delivering what they've been asked to deliver? And that's what matters ultimately. We're not going to ever be able to bring every single person on board in this discussion, but what we need to make sure is that they understand that this is what we're doing as an organisation and that they need to join us in that way.
Yeah, I think when you talked to me about the 3 groups, I found that kind of quite useful to have, as, you know, you will have people that are more passionate and, you know, lead from the front and do it for the right reasons, and then people that ultimately kind of follow that group. Is that right?
So yeah, you've got the people who are really interested in this, who believe in this, who are going to focus and really engage in this discussion. And then you'll have people think this is a really good business reason. We want to do that for a really good business reason, and they'll keep up with them because it's obviously good business. And then you have people who will think, oh, everybody else is doing it, so I better have as well.
Yeah,
and you will get those groups of people. Yeah.
Another question here. So we've recently been looking at expanding our HR policies on diversity and inclusion. Where would you suggest is a good place to start?
So do you have an equality, diversity and inclusion policy? Do you have something that says our commitment to making sure that people are not discriminated against? Do you have a policy about that? And so first of all, that's the first place to start, writing a diversity, inclusion, equality, diversity, equity, diversity, inclusion, and respect, any and all of the above. Do you have a policy to cover this area, first of all? Then looking generally at your HR policies, looking and seeing how they are or aren't inclusive. And so what happens for people who are, so you've got things like parental leave in terms of maternity care, pregnancy leave, and looking at shared parental and paternity leave. So there's those areas. You have provisions for carers and carer leave, sick pay, all of those sorts of things are really specific areas of the HR policies that are covered as part of what you would consider equality, diversity, and inclusion areas. But broadly speaking, do your HR policies support the employees and your staff in the organisation? Are they forward thinking about how they look after people, generally speaking? So we want to take a proactive approach. Remember, inclusion is active and it's ongoing. So are we taking the best advice and the best approaches to looking after people and engaging? Of course, there's going to have to be a balance in what we do and what we can afford to do and what, where our budgets allow us in terms of being completely, innovative in these areas. But we need to weigh that up in terms of what we give and what we don't. And so how we can adjust that and how we mitigate those means. But I think generally looking at the areas of the Equality Act that will impact your way of looking at your policy are a really good framework to start with, for example. And I say that as a starting point because it's not everything. It really isn't everything. But it's nice to be able to look at it and say, are you including provision for non-binary members of staff to use other pronouns in their titles and in their information? Do you have an MX option or other title options that people can use in their spaces? And so things like that, sort of really basic, how difficult is it for you to change your name if you need to do so as a part of your and so being inclusive in all the different ways possible, and by running down that list is an easy way to do it.
Yeah, I think we've recently, through the networks that we've got in Goodman Masson, so Pride at Goodman Masson, Balance at Goodman Masson, and Origin at Goodman Masson, there's actually been feedback from the business to senior management in terms of actually these are policies and amendments that we're interested in. I think that's worked well as well, actually having, perhaps that checklist approach, but also then kind of bottom up feedback from the business.
Yeah, absolutely. And because the people who are experiencing this every day are engaging with that process, and that's brilliant. Yeah,
definitely. We've got one here. So I want to scrap the standard bank holidays and allow employees to take flexi holiday instead so that they can use them around their preferred religious holidays. Would that be possible legally?
So there are a couple of bank holidays that the government approves and provides and requires, and those have to stand generally. But there are a lot of them that happen throughout the year that are not required, that are not mandatory, that are worked, and so those can be adjusted and changed. But in some organisations, what they'll do is, as you say, they'll give you, well, these are the 3 bank holidays. Here's 3 days in change. You can use it on that day if you'd like, or you can use it on a different day. And so yes, I have seen that policy work in other organisations and areas for the bank holidays that are not legally mandatory.
Okay. That's interesting. And have you any advice for smaller organisations with less than 40 people when it comes to benchmarking and the recruitment of a diverse workforce?
Sometimes it means with small numbers, especially, and especially if maybe your organisation overlaps in multiple sectors or different organisations in different ways and numbers. And so benchmarking externally is not necessarily going to be the best way for you to move forwards. Sometimes that means that you want to benchmark against yourself. So you can set your targets to looking at, I'm going to look at the people who are in the region, who are in this area, and I'm going to look at that and see whether or not, but who are my feeder pool to my pool of employees as well, as much as anything else. And so however you set that. So if you know that all the people who come to you come having done a marketing degree beforehand, then you can look up and see what marketing degrees, what the demographics are of people who have completed a marketing degree. That information is available via the Higher Education Statistics Authority, HESA, and you can get the information and you can say, okay, of the people who have graduated with a marketing degree, I know that this many people are from this demographic, and this is not what we have in our pool here at the organisation. So be creative about how you look at comparators, but ultimately you want to monitor and benchmark yourself against yourself. So what's the change each year? Where's the change and progress, and where do you want to be? We know that the UK population demographics are available from the Office for National Statistics, so you can get that and use that as a broad guide of where you want to be. You can get that from your region as well. And so sometimes the region is more appropriate to where you are. And that's, I would say that that's a closer approximation of what you're looking for, generally speaking, but they may not represent your feeder pool. So it's worth looking at that as well.
Yeah, I think linked to that in that benchmarking question idea, you know, where do you get your benchmarking information from? It's definitely something that Goodman Masson, for example, and other consultancies should be able to provide in terms of, you know, the candidate registrations that are going on, or what does that market look like currently for kind of specialist recruitments and specialist sectors. Or interestingly, I know when we looked at, you know, Office of National Statistics versus do you take a more innovative approach and look at Stonewall's data, for example. So yeah, definitely good questions in terms of where do you benchmark from and what do you benchmark against. So typically in the past, in the UK, data around D&I has always been restricted to the point that UK firms could only comment on gender diversity, whereas counterparts say that in the US they have a lot more data to leverage from. Has the rules in the UK now changed, which allows us to start tracking specific data beyond gender?
Yeah, I'm not aware of rules that restricted that in the recent past. And so, you know, with the advent of the Equality Act in 2010, that at least has been times when we've been expected to collect data and around all the different diversity areas. And those are the Equality Act is specifically related to protected characteristics, and we mentioned those earlier on in the presentation. And so that data is a part of how we monitor and collect. Now, the government only currently requires gender pay gap reporting, though it is talking about ethnicity pay gap reporting. So I don't know if that's more to do with what we're talking about here, but there are no restrictions on collecting that data if, according to GDPR, you have a good reason for doing so. So are you collecting religious data just to see if we've got people who are religion or belief, or are you collecting it because you want to know whether or not you should create a prayer room? You should create a prayer room, by the way. But if you're collecting it for the sake of collecting it, then that's not an appropriate use of that data. And keep in mind that data beyond gender is well, in terms of the protected characteristics, most of them are considered sensitive data under the General Data Protection Regulations. So you have to be particularly careful with that.
So what do you do if people on your senior leadership team are interested in ED&I for? Oh, we've had this one. Sorry, that's a repeat. Inclusion involves accepting a huge range of views, but building a high performance organisation usually involves building a culture based on narrow, clear sets of shared values. How do you manage these two simultaneously? So how do you manage high performance and those values along with inclusion?
I think that the really good area that in terms of my role, my title is diversity, inclusion and respect. Mm-hmm. And I think respect is key in this area. We don't have to agree with each other. We don't have to agree that what everybody says is the truth. I don't have to sit in the same place as you by politics. I don't have to sit with you theoretically. I don't have to sit with you on a faith and religion basis, but I do have to respect your views and position in this discussion. And that's what we need to make sure we're doing. We're being respectful. And so it may be that the organization is saying, we want to focus on diversity and inclusion. That means including all sorts of different people. But remember that your diversity protected characteristics does not overwrite another person's. And it's really important to understand and respect each person's position. We don't tolerate inappropriate language, inappropriate behavior. Those sorts of messages are important. And so I think it's important that the organization is really clear about celebrating identity and identity differences and celebrating all of the people so that everybody feels like they can bring their whole self to the workplace.
Perfect. I think that's about us for questions. So thanks very much for your time, Lenna. That's been great. And as I mentioned at the beginning, we will be running more specific sessions. I think there's been a lot of demand and we want to continue to share knowledge and set up networking events. So if you've got a particular part of diversity and inclusion that you think we could facilitate a networking event on, get in touch and let us know what that is. We're in the process of building our calendar for 2021, so we can build that in. Thanks very much.
Yeah. I think one of the really key messages, if I could just pass on that last thing before everybody goes, is this is one way. We're showing you one example, one little way of doing this framework of including diversity inclusion. And, you know, Catherine's talked about us later on really diving deeper into specific areas and building on that. So remember, the vision, the strategy, the objectives, the methodologies that we've suggested here, this is just a really an overview of how we can do that in one way. It's never going to be the same for everybody. And so, you know, the more detailed sessions will be an opportunity for us to dig more deeper into the different ways that people need to do it.
Yeah, definitely. Thanks very much.
Thank you. Cheers.